Montana Territory, December 1883. The wind cut sharp as a knife through the cracks in the barn walls, and Preston Rourke nearly rode past it, snow crusting the brim of his hat and his coat stiff with ice. He had been heading back toward his cabin after checking the far pasture, reins loose, mind dull and empty like the sky above. He had not spoken out loud in 2 days. He had not wanted to. The mare spooked near the old hay barn, ears pricking forward, nostrils flaring. "Easy, girl," Preston muttered, but his own heart had kicked up. He dismounted, boots crunching over frozen ground, and pushed the barn door open slow. At first he saw nothing. Then in the far corner, curled up beneath a threadbare wool blanket and half buried in hay, he spotted the shape of a woman. Her face was pale, lips cracked, hair tangled and wet from snowmelt. She was barely awake, eyes fluttering open just enough to see him. "Do not." "Take me back," she whispered, breath a ghost in the cold. "I am not tacking you anywhere." Preston dropped to his knees beside her. "You are freezing to death." She tried to push herself upright, but her arm gave out. He caught her before she hit the floor. "Let me help," he said, voice low and steady. She did not answer, but she did not fight him either. He wrapped her in his coat, lifted her gently, and carried her out into the wind. Back at the cabin, he had the fire roaring and the kettle on before he even got his gloves off. He laid her out on his cot, piled every quilt he owned on top of her, and rubbed warmth back into her hands with his own. Her fingers were thin and trembling. There were bruises along her jaw and a cut above one brow, scabbed over but angry red beneath. When her eyes opened again, hours later, she stared at the ceiling as if unsure where she was. "You are safe," Preston said from the chair beside the fire. She turned her head slowly. "You are the man from the barn." "Yes, ma'am," she blinked. "I thought I might be dead." "You are not." He stood cross to her and offered a tin cup filled with warm broth. "Here, drink this." She sat up with effort and took the cup in both hands. After a few sips, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." He nodded once. "What is your name?" She hesitated, then said, "Rowena Whitlow." He waited. She said nothing else. He did not press. By morning, the worst of the snow had passed. Pale sunlight filtered through the frosted windows. Preston was chopping wood out back when he heard the door creak open. Rowena stepped into the light, wrapped in one of his old coats, too big for her, sleeves rolled. Her hair hung clean and damp over her shoulders. She had washed somehow while he was outside. He stopped mid-swing and stared. She came closer, arms crossed tight, and looked up at him. "I know I should be gone already," she said, "but I do not have anywhere else to go." He set down the axe slowly. "I did not ask you to leave." She gave a shaky breath. "You saved me. You needed saving?" "I still do," he nodded. "You can stay." Something flickered in her eyes, then relief maybe, or something even softer. "And you?" she asked. "What about me? You look like someone who stopped needing the world." He swallowed hard. "My husband is dead," she said. "He died 5 months ago." But he died long before that, truly, in his fists, in his silence. Preston said nothing. "My children." Her voice broke. "I left them in Kansas with my sister. I had to. I could not bring them with me, not until I knew I could make something better." Preston's jaw clenched. "Do they know you are alive?" "I sent a letter from Billings. Told them I would send for them when I had work." Her eyes filled. "But there was no work for a woman alone, not without price." Preston looked down at his boots, then back at her. "You can stay here. We will figure something out." Rowena stepped closer. "Why would you help me?" "Because you are standing here," he said, "and I did not think I would ever see someone stand here again." She blinked. "I lost my brother last winter," he said, "and my father before him. This place has been quiet ever since. Too quiet." Rowena's hand found his, fingers cold but steady. "Then maybe we both needed someone to remind us we are still alive." He looked at her. Really looked. "You gave me a reason to come back in this house," he said. "To light the fire. To care again." She smiled, small but real. "I guess we found each other in the cold," she said. He squeezed her hand gently. "And maybe that is worth something." They stood like that for a long time, the wind quiet, the sky slowly turning blue again. Preston found her in the lean-to behind the house just after sunrise, sleeves rolled, hands sunk into a basin of icy water. She was scrubbing one of his shirts like it were her own. "You ain't got to do that," he said, stepping into the doorway. Rowena didn't look up. "I can't just sit there under your roof eating your food pretending I'm furniture." "You're not," he said. "I know," she replied. "That's why I'm working." He didn't argue. Instead, he stepped aside so the morning light could fall warmer across her shoulders. She hadn't asked to borrow his clothes, but she wore them like she'd mended them herself. And the way she stood straight-backed, wrists steady, she looked less like someone recovering and more like someone remembering who she'd been before. Preston leaned against the doorframe. "You ever worked a homestead?" Rowena wrung out the cloth before meeting his eyes. "I was raised on one near Ottawa before Pa lost the land. You know how to hitch a team, can yoke a pair of mules in my sleep." He nodded. "You might be more useful than me." "Not likely," she said, but there was the ghost of a smile in it. Later, she followed him out to the fence line where a post had given way under last week's weight of snow. He handed her the hammer without a word. She took it without flinching. "They always say women are too soft for this," she muttered, fitting a fresh board into place. "Never met a soft pine that didn't hold a nail." Rowena's mouth twitched. "That's supposed to be a compliment, might be." They worked in rhythm after that, no need for talk. Her hands weren't afraid of splinters. She moved like someone who'd spent years holding things together that didn't want to stay whole. When the sun dipped low, they sat on the porch steps and shared the last of the bread with salt pork. She didn't complain once about the cold. Preston watched her from the corner of his eye. "You mean to send for your children soon?" She wiped her hands on her skirt. "Come spring, if I've earned enough, I won't bring them into hardship." He nodded slowly. "They'll be lucky to have you back." "They're the only thing I ever got right," she said softly. Preston didn't speak. He stared out across the snowfield, jaw tight. "You got kin?" she asked after a while. He let out a breath through his nose. "Had a brother, Jesse, younger by 2 years. We built this cabin together." Rowena looked down at her hands. "Was it illness? Blizzard. Tried to get the cattle back in. I told him to wait till morning." Preston's voice went quiet. "He didn't." She reached over, not to touch, just to be near. "I'm sorry." He nodded and stood. "I'll fetch more firewood." Rowena watched him walk away, boots crunching over thin ice. She didn't follow. That night she pulled a quilt over his shoulders where he sat half asleep in the chair by the hearth. He didn't open his eyes, but his hand found her wrist and stayed there, warm and still. "Thank you," he murmured. Rowena's voice was barely a whisper. "You don't have to be alone anymore." He didn't let go. She didn't pull away, and in the quiet, the cabin no longer felt like something half full. It felt like something beginning. By late January, the drifts had crusted over, thick enough to walk across without sinking. The sky held that washed-out hue that meant the worst of winter had settled in for a while. Preston and Rowena moved through the days like they'd been doing so for years, quiet tasks shared without ceremony. He didn't question how easily she fit into the rhythm of the place. She didn't offer apologies for it either. She was mending harness leather when he returned from checking the upper creek. He stamped snow off his boots and leaned the rifle against the wall. "There's fresh elk sign up near the ridge," he said. "Could try for one tomorrow." She didn't look up. "I've tanned hides before. If you leave the skin, I can make use of it." "You know how to work rawhide?" "My grandfather did. He taught me before I was tall enough to reach the drying rack." Preston unbuttoned his coat, watching the way her fingers moved in small, practiced motions. "Where was he from?" "North Missouri. Osage side." She paused, then tied off the thread. "He married my grandmother before the war. She was Irish. They didn't belong many places." He sat on the edge of the table. "You get that same feeling?" "I never fit neatly," she said. "Not in town, not in church, not with women who spoke soft and men who thought themselves owners of things they hadn't earned." She set the leather down and looked at him. "But I don't feel out of place here." He met her gaze. "You're not." Rowena nodded once, then stood. "I should bring in more kindling before it gets dark." "I already cut some," he said, rising. "I'll carry it in." They crossed the yard together, boots crunching over frozen ground. The wind had gone still. The only sound was the scrape of wood against iron as Preston lifted the latch on the shed. Rowena reached for a bundle, but he stopped her with a hand on her arm. "You've done enough today." She studied him for a moment, then stepped back. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and find this place gone," she said. "Or that I imagined it. You didn't." "I lived in a house once where I flinched every time the door opened," she said. "Now I hear you come in and it feels like something steady." Preston looked down at the logs in his hands. "I used to think I was built for solitude. But all it ever did was wear me thinner." He glanced at her. "You've brought something back I thought I'd buried." She didn't answer, but when he turned, she followed him back into the cabin and didn't let the door close between them. That night, she poured water from the kettle into the basin and laid a cloth across his shoulders. "You've been out in that wind all day," she said. "Your skin's raw." He sat still, letting her press the warm cloth over the back of his neck. Her fingers were gentle but sure. "You don't have to take care of me," he said. "I want to." He turned his head just enough to see her face. "Why?" "Because you gave me space to be someone again." Her voice was low, steady. "And because I see the way you look at me when you think I ain't watching." He exhaled through his nose, quiet. "You see too much. You don't hide it well." Preston reached up, caught her hand where it rested on his shoulder and held it there. "I ain't said anything because I didn't want to chase off what's growing here," he said. "But you've been under my skin since the second day." Her throat moved as she swallowed. "You waited for me to say it first." "I was waiting to be sure." "I am." He stood, still holding her hand. "Then I want you to stay, not just through the thaw." She nodded once. "I already meant to." Preston leaned in, slow, giving her time. When their lips met, it wasn't a claiming, it was an answer. Outside, the wind shifted in the trees. Inside, the fire burned down to coals, and neither one of them reached for another blanket. The thaw came late that year. Snow lingered in the shadows even through March, pressed hard against the north side of the barn and the base of the cottonwoods along the creek. Mud slicked the yard by midday, froze again each night. The cabin walls sighed with the shift of seasons, wood expanding with damp air, roof creaking under the slow drip of meltwater. Preston was up early as always. He'd taken to checking the traps near the ridge before sunrise, and Rowena never asked if he needed help. She knew better than to crowd a man who carried silence like armor. But some mornings, when the wind was soft and the horizon gold-edged, he'd lean against the doorframe a moment longer before stepping out, and she'd feel his quiet linger like warmth on her skin. That afternoon, she found him at the stream, sleeves rolled, sleeves muddy to the elbow, dragging stones into a small wall along the bank. She stayed at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed. "You're building something?" Her voice was light, but her eyes stayed on his hands. Preston looked up. "Trying to keep spring from washing the bank out again." She stepped closer, boots sinking slightly in the damp moss. "Why now?" He straightened, wiping his palms on his trousers. "Because you said you're sending for your children." Rowena blinked, caught off guard. "That's still weeks off." He gave a small nod. "I want this place sound before they come. I want them to have a place that holds." She stared at him, then down at the stones, solid and wet and carefully chosen. "You think they'll take to you?" "I don't know," he said. "But I aim to be someone worth their mother's trust." Her breath caught, something deep and quiet moving behind her ribs. "They've never had a man they could lean on. Then let them learn how it feels." She crouched beside him, picked up a flat stone and placed it beside the others. "They'll ask about you." He glanced at her. "What'll you say?" "That you have a good back," she said, laying another stone and better hands, "that you don't speak unless it matters. That you built something with me stone by stone." He didn't answer, but he stayed beside her, and together they shaped the bank until the sun dipped low and the chill crept in again. That night, a letter arrived by way of a ranch hand from downriver. Preston took it from the man's glove and handed him a biscuit from the hearth before sending him on. Rowena opened the letter slowly by lantern light, her fingers steady. "It's from me," she said. "My sister. She says the children are well, they've been helping on the farm." Laura's grown out of her shoes again. Preston leaned against the mantel. You want me to ride into town with you when it's time? Rowena folded the paper. You do that. You shouldn't go alone. She looked up. I don't feel alone anymore. Preston crossed the room, took her hand, and brushed his thumb across her knuckles. They'll come home to you, and I'll be right beside you when they do. Her voice was thick. You sure about that? He nodded once. I've never been more certain of anything. She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around her, resting his cheek against her hair. The fire cracked and settled behind them. She closed her eyes, listening to the even sound of his breathing. You're the first man I've ever trusted with the quiet parts of me, she whispered. And you're the first woman who made me want to speak. Outside, the snow retreated inch by inch from the fields. Inside, two lives stitched themselves into something whole. By early April, the land had softened enough to take a plow. Preston hitched the team and turned over the first row without a word, eyes fixed on the dark, thawed soil curling behind the blade. Rowena stood off to the side, one hand shading her brow, the other holding the letter she'd gotten the day before. Her sister had named the date. The children would arrive at the station in Helena in 12 days. She waited until he'd unhitched the horses and rubbed them down before she spoke. I'll need to leave by next week. Preston leaned his forearm on the stall door. I'll ride with you, she nodded. Me says Laura's grown taller than Ruth now. She's only 9. You think they'll remember you the way you were? Rowena pressed the folded letter between her palms. They'll remember I left, but they'll see why I did. He stepped forward, hand brushing her elbow. They'll see what kind of woman you've become. Rowena met his eyes. I want them to see the kind of man you are, too. I ain't much good with children, he said. You've never had your own. No, she looked down at his hands, still dusted with earth. Give them steadiness. That's more than most ever get. The next morning, she packed a canvas bag with the few things she'd kept from before, a clay pendant her daughter had shaped from river mud, a creased drawing of a house with a crooked chimney, and a comb missing 2 teeth. Preston didn't ask what she left behind. He only saddled the horses and filled the canteen. They rode out at dawn, along the trail. Preston caught glimpses of her watching the trees, her posture tight, as though the closer they got to town, the more she braced for something unnamed. You thinking of turning back? He asked once, when they stopped to rest the horses near a narrow creek. I'm thinking of what I'll say if they ask why I stayed away so long. He sat beside her on the bank. You don't owe them shame. You got them free. Rowena let a stone fall from her hand into the water. Sometimes I still feel like I'm waiting for permission to breathe. You don't need it anymore. She turned toward him. You're the only person who's ever said that. Preston reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Then I'll keep saying it every morning if I have to. The train pulled in late, steam curling over the platform, whistle sharp and sudden. Rowena stood still until the last car hissed to a stop. Then, without a word, she stepped forward. Laura was the first off. Tall, lean, with her mother's eyes and her father's wary shoulders. Ruth followed, smaller, face round with 2 serious eyes. They paused when they saw Rowena, as if unsure where to place her inside the shape of their memory. Rowena knelt. You've both grown. Ruth clutched her sister's hand. Me said you were different now. I am, Rowena said. Laura looked past her to Preston, who stood back a ways, hat in hand. Who's he? Rowena stood. His name's Preston, he's kind, he listens, and he built a home with me. Laura studied him a long moment. Is there a stove? There is. Does it smoke? Only when I bake, Rowena said. Laura's mouth twitched and she stepped forward. By the time they reached the cabin 2 days later, Ruth was asleep in Preston's arms, head tucked under his chin. Laura rode ahead with Rowena, asking questions about the barn, the creek, the animals. That first night, Preston stoked the fire high while Rowena tucked the girls into the bed they'd made from Jessia's old cot and a mattress stuffed fresh with wool. Neither girl asked for a story. They only watched their mother until their eyes closed. Preston stood in the doorway, quiet. Rowena came to him, her arms wrapping around his waist, her head resting against his chest. "You didn't have to carry Ruth the whole way," she murmured. She didn't let go. He held her there, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and lavender from the sachet she tucked into the girl's blankets. Rowena tilted her face up. "They'll need time, I've got time," she smiled, slow and sure. "So do I." In the weeks that followed, they slipped into new rhythms. Laura helped with the chickens. Ruth learned to braid rope, and Preston found himself building a swing from an old wagon seat and 2 lengths of chain. He never said much, but when Ruth fell asleep by the fire, he was the one who carried her to bed. When Laura scraped her knee, he handed her the clean rag without a word and sat beside her until she stopped crying. Rowena watched him from the doorway one evening, the girls playing a game with pebbles and sticks under a patch of warm light. "You've made yourself part of their days," she said. Preston looked up. "I didn't try to. That's what makes it real." He crossed the room and pulled her close. "You made me part of yours first," she leaned into him. "I want to marry you," he stilled, then rested his forehead against hers. "I was going to ask you come summer." "I don't want to wait, neither do I." They said the vows by the creek, where the bank still bore the stones they'd placed together. Laura braided flowers into her mother's hair, and Ruth held Preston's hand the whole time. There was no preacher, only words spoken plain and true, and the wind carrying them through the cottonwoods like they'd always belonged. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep beside the hearth, Rowena stood at the cabin window, watching the last light fade from the hills. Preston came up behind her, arms circling her waist. "You still waiting for permission to breathe?" She turned in his arms. "No, I'm breathing now." Outside, the stars blinked into place, steady as fence posts. Inside, the warmth of home wrapped around them earned quiet whole. A life built slow and sure with no more leaving, and they never would again.